It was the silence that reached her first. Not the mountains, though they filled the sky like the shoulders of sleeping giants draped in pines so dark it looked almost black against the late autumn light. Not the cold either, though it pressed against her skin with the kind of authority that told her winter was not coming, but had already arrived and was simply waiting for someone to notice. It was the silence. A silence so complete, so absolute that Dorrit Pembroke could hear her own heartbeat knocking against her ribs like a fist on a locked door. The stagecoach had left her 20 minutes ago. She had watched it rattle down the trail until it disappeared behind a bend, the driver never once looking back, as if dropping a young woman alone at the edge of nowhere was something he did every Tuesday and thought nothing of. And maybe he did. Maybe this territory swallowed women whole every week, and the drivers had learned not to care. Derby Station was not a town. It was barely a place. A single log structure with a sagging roof, a water trough for horses green with algae, and a wooden sign nailed to a post that read Derby, in letters so faded they might have been written by a ghost who had since moved on. Beyond the station, the trail curved upward into the mountains, narrow and steep, disappearing into the trees like a secret no one wanted to share. Dorrit stood beside her valise, the only piece of luggage she owned in this world. It was small, made of cracked leather, the color of dried tobacco, and it held everything she had. One dress cream, white with lace at the collar, and cuffs already dusted from 2,000 miles of road. One pair of stockings, a bar of soap wrapped in brown paper, a cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother pinned now at her throat like a tiny shield, and one book, its spine broken and its pages soft from years of handling. Jane Eyre, the only companion that had never left her. She was 22 years old and she had come to marry a man she had never met. The advertisement had been small, tucked between notices for patent medicine and land sales in the back pages of the Matrimonial Times. She had found the paper in a trash bin behind the Hendricks household in Philadelphia, where she had worked as a domestic servant for 2 years after aging out of the orphanage. The Hendricks family had not been kind. Mrs. Hendricks had a habit of striking Dorrit across the knuckles with a wooden spoon when the silver was not polished to her satisfaction, and Mr. Hendricks had a habit of standing too close in doorways, a habit Dorrit had learned to navigate with the precision of someone walking through a room full of broken glass and bare feet. She had left the Hendricks household with $11 of bruise on her left wrist and a resolution carved so deep into her chest it felt like bone. She would never again live at the mercy of people who saw her as less than human. The advertisement had been written in a hand that was careful but unpracticed, the letters of a man more accustomed to holding reins than pens. 3 brothers seek wife, courageous woman willing to live in mountain country. Write to Caleb Whitfield, Elk Ridge Ranch, Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory. She had written back the same night, sitting on the floor of a boarding house that smelled of boiled cabbage and kerosene, the letter balanced on her knee. I am not beautiful in any remarkable way. I am not wealthy, but I know how to sew, how to cook, and I am not afraid of hard work. If you need a woman who can keep a fire burning in a home, I am willing to come. The reply had arrived 3 weeks later. 2 lines in the same careful hand. Come before the snow falls. We will be waiting at Derby. And so she had come. 2,000 miles by train and stagecoach. Through cities that shrank into towns, towns that shrank into settlements, settlements that shrank into nothing but grass and sky and the long, empty breath of the plains. She had watched the landscape change around her, the way a person watches a fever dream, unfold each mile, stripping away another layer of the world she knew, until there was nothing left but mountains and silence, and the hard, bright fact of her own aloneness. Now she stood at Derby Station, and no one was here. She checked the sky. The sun was already sliding toward the ridgeline, turning the clouds the color of old copper. 2 hours of light left, maybe less. She had no food, no water, no horse, and no idea where Elk Ridge Ranch was, except that it was somewhere up there in those mountains that looked like they had been placed on Earth specifically to remind human beings how small they were. She gripped the handle of her valise and told herself she would not cry. Crying was a luxury she had given up at 16, kneeling beside the shared grave of her parents in a cemetery outside Pittsburgh, where the coal dust settled on the headstones like black snow. Her father had died in a mine collapse. Her mother had died 3 months later of something the doctor called exhaustion, but Dorrit knew was grief. Grief could kill you just as surely as a cave-in. It just took longer, and no one brought flowers. She heard them before she saw them. Hoofbeats, not one horse. 3. Coming from the north from somewhere deep in the tree line, the sound building like distant thunder rolling down a canyon. She turned toward it, her hand instinctively rising to the cameo at her throat, and watched the tree line break open. 3 riders emerged from the pines, moving in formation side by side, their horses matched in stride. They were big men. Not just tall, but built on a scale that seemed designed for a different, rougher world, broad through the shoulders and thick through the arms, sitting their saddles with the easy authority of men who had been born on horseback. And they were all 3 of them unmistakably identical. Same height, well over 6.5 feet, same chestnut brown hair, sun-streaked at the temples falling in rough waves to their collars, same amber eyes the color of whiskey held up to firelight, same square jaw, same high cheekbones, same straight nose with a slight bump at the bridge that suggested it had been broken at least once and set by hand rather than by a doctor. They were not just brothers. They were the same man printed 3 times, as if God had liked the design so much he decided to make copies. The one in the middle dismounted first. He moved with a deliberateness that suggested every action was considered, every gesture measured, as if he had learned long ago that carelessness cost more than he could afford. He removed his hat, a wide-brimmed thing stained dark with sweat and weather, and stood before her. He was up close, even larger than he had appeared on horseback. Dorrit was 5 feet and 3 inches tall. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and when she did, she found them watching her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not cold exactly, but guarded. Careful. The expression of a man who had learned to keep the important things locked behind his face. "Miss Pembroke," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that did not need volume to carry weight. "Mr. Whitfield," she replied. She held his gaze, though her heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Which one?" The one still mounted on the left let out a short, sharp sound through his nose. That one sat with his arms crossed over the saddle horn, looking down at her with an expression that was not hostile, but was certainly not welcoming. He had the same face as the man before her, but his wore it differently. Where the first man's features were held in careful stillness, this one's were alive with restless energy, a constant tightening of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, a tension in the shoulders that suggested he was always at every moment ready to hit something. "That her," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "She looks like the wind would snap her clean in half." The words landed on Dorrit like a slap, but she had been slapped before by hands much harder than words, and she had learned that the only way to survive a blow was to stay standing. She looked up at him directly without flinching. "The wind has blown me 2,000 miles to get here, sir. I have not snapped yet." The third brother, still standing beside his horse, laughed. It was a warm sound, unexpected and genuine, the kind of laugh that breaks open a tense room like sunlight through a crack in a wall. The one on horseback shot him a glare, but the corner of his own mouth twitched just barely before he caught it. The first brother, the one she now understood to be Ransom, loaded her valise onto the pack horse without ceremony. "The trail up takes 2 hours," he said. "Hold on tight." She was given a horse to ride, a gentle gray mare with a white blaze on her forehead and calm, intelligent eyes. The youngest brother, the one who had laughed, brought the mare forward and held the stirrup for her. His name, she would learn, was Phelan. He had the same face as his brothers, but he wore it the way some people wear old clothes, comfortably, without pretension, as if handsomeness was something he had inherited, but never thought much about. "This is Dove," he said. "She is the gentlest horse on the ranch. She will take care of you." Dorrit had never been on a horse in her life. She gripped the saddle horn with both hands, her knuckles white, her jaw set, and swung herself up with a gracefulness that surprised even her. The mare shifted beneath her, warm and solid, and Dorrit felt for one strange moment as if the animal understood something about her that no person ever had. They rode. The trail climbed steeply through old growth pine, the trees so tall and so close together that the light filtered down in broken shafts, turning the forest floor into a patchwork of gold and shadow. The air smelled of resin and cold earth, and something else, something mineral and ancient, the smell of stone that had been stone for 10,000 years and intended to be stone for 10,000 more. Dorrit watched the 3 brothers as they rode. Ransom led his back straight, his eyes forward, never once turning around. But every few minutes, his hand would rise from his side and make a small gesture, Fingers spread or fists closed, signaling something to the riders behind him. Slow down. Low branch ahead. Turn left. He did not speak, but he was aware of everything: the trail, the horses, the weather, and the woman behind him who was gripping the saddle with hands that had never held reins. Bridger, the second brother, rode in the middle. He glanced back at Dorrit over his shoulder every few minutes with an expression of skeptical appraisal, the way a man might look at a new tool he did not trust. His hands on the reins were scarred and heavy, the hands of someone who worked with fire and iron, and even sitting still, he radiated a kinetic energy that made the air around him feel charged. Phelan rode behind Dorrit close enough that she could hear his hoarse breathing. He said nothing, but she noticed that every time Dove stumbled on a loose stone or slipped on a wet root, Phelan's hand was already on her horse's bridle, steadying the animal before Dorrit even felt the shift. He did it so smoothly, so naturally, that she might not have noticed if she had not been watching. 3 men, 3 ways of protecting. Ransom led the way. Bridger watched for threats. Phelan caught her when she fell. She filed this knowledge away in the part of her mind where she kept important things, the part that had learned to read people the way other children learn to read books: quickly, carefully, because understanding the people around you was sometimes the difference between a good day and a bad one, between safety and pain. When they broke through the tree line and the valley opened before them, Dorrit stopped breathing. Elk Ridge Ranch sat in a small valley tucked into the side of the mountain, like a secret held in a cupped hand. A log cabin, large and solid, built from timber, so old it had turned the color of dark honey. A stable, a corral, fences that stretched toward the edge of the forest, marking boundaries that seemed less like property lines and more like a conversation between the land and the men who lived on it. Beyond the ranch, the mountains rose in every direction, their peaks already dusted white with early snow, and above them the sky was so wide and so blue, it looked like something painted by someone who had never learned the meaning of restraint. It was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. Then she walked into the cabin. The inside was a catastrophe, dirty plates stacked in piles that had achieved a kind of architectural ambition. Clothes strewn across every surface, draped over chairs and hanging from nails in the wall, like the shed skins of very large, very untidy animals. The stove was cold, its belly full of gray ash. The table was buried under a layer of tools, rope, leather scraps, and what appeared to be the disassembled parts of a saddle. The smell was a complex composition of tanned hidewood smoke, dried meat, and the particular musk of 3 grown men who had been living without the civilizing influence of soap, laundry, or shame. Dorrit stood in the doorway. She looked at the mess. She looked at the 3 brothers standing behind her, each one of them suddenly very interested in something on the ceiling, or the floor, or the middle distance. She said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then she set down her valise, rolled up her sleeves, and began to clean. She did not complain. She did not comment. She did not ask why grown men who could apparently fell trees and break horses had not managed to wash a plate in what appeared to be several weeks. She simply started the way she had always started every task in her life, with her hands and her silence and the grim, quiet determination of someone who understood that the only way through was through. Bridger leaned toward Ransom and muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear, "At least she does not whine." The first week was a silent war. Dorrit cooked, cleaned, scrubbed, washed, mended, swept, and organized. She brought order to the cabin the way a river brings order to a canyon, slowly, relentlessly wearing down resistance through sheer persistence. She rose before dawn and fell asleep after dark, and in between, she moved through the cabin and the yard with a focused energy that left the 3 brothers with nothing to criticize and no reason to speak. They did not make it easy. Ransom was polite but distant. He ate her meals, nodded his thanks, and disappeared into the stable until after dark. He treated her with the careful courtesy of a man hosting a guest he had not invited and did not know how to entertain. There was no warmth in it, but there was no cruelty either. He was simply absent, present in body, and gone in every other way that mattered. Bridger was worse. He was honest in the way that a hammer is honest, blunt and hard, and entirely without subtlety. "The rice is too soft," he said on the second night, pushing his plate forward half an inch. "My mother never made rice too soft." The words were delivered without malice, which somehow made them sting more. He was not trying to hurt her. He was simply stating a fact the way he might state that a fence post was crooked or a horseshoe was poorly fitted, and the indifference was more painful than any insult. Dorrit swallowed the anger. She went to bed. She woke up. She made the rice again. This time it was perfect, each grain separate and firm, cooked with a precision that bordered on defiance. Bridger ate the entire pot without a word. He did not compliment her. He did not need to. An empty pot was the highest praise he knew how to give. Phelan was the only one who tried. He asked her about Philadelphia, about the train ride, about the book she had brought. He had noticed the book almost immediately the way he noticed everything about animals and people quietly from the edges without making a fuss. He had a gift for observation that he disguised as casualness, a way of seeing everything while appearing to look at nothing. "You brought a book," he said, one evening leaning against the doorframe while she washed dishes. "Jane Eyre. I have heard of it but never read it." "It is about a woman who refuses to be less than she is," Dorrit said without turning around. "No matter what the world tries to make her." Phelan was quiet for a moment. Then he said softly, "She sounds like someone I would like." But every time Phelan showed warmth toward Dorrit, Ransom's eyes would find him across the room with a look that was not angry, but was unmistakably a warning. And Bridger would let out that sound through his nose, that sharp exhale that communicated more disapproval than most men could express in a paragraph. On the ninth night, Dorrit could not sleep. She rose from bed and padded barefoot to the kitchen for water, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders against the cold that seeped through the cabin walls like a living thing. She rounded the corner and stopped. Ransom sat alone at the table. Before him lay a single sheet of paper yellowed with age, the creases so deep and so often folded that the letter looked like it might fall apart at the touch. He was reading it, or perhaps he had already read it and was simply holding it the way a man might hold the hand of someone who had already gone. His face was in shadow, but his hands were visible in the lamplight, and they were shaking. Those hands. Massive callus scarred across the knuckles, hands that could wrestle a steer to the ground or split a log with a single stroke. And they were trembling over a piece of paper like leaves in a wind that only he could feel. Dorrit stepped back silent as breath and returned to her room. She did not mention it. She did not ask. Some things were not hers to know. Not yet. But the next day, while cleaning beneath the table, she found the letter where it had fallen from his pocket. She did not mean to read it, but the first line caught her eye the way a hand catches a falling object by reflex before the mind can intervene. "Ransom, my son. Keep your brothers. Keep this land. Do not let anyone take it from you. That is the last promise your mother asks." It was signed Margaret Whitfield, and the handwriting was so shaky, so thin, that Dorrit knew it had been written by a woman who was very sick, writing the last words she would ever write. Dorrit folded the letter carefully, placed it back exactly where she had found it, and stood. She understood now. The weight he carried, the silence, the wall he had built between himself and the world. He was not cold. He was crushed. Crushed beneath a promise made to a dying woman 12 years ago, a promise he had kept every single day since, at the cost of everything else. His youth, his joy, his right to want anything for himself. She understood because she too knew what it meant to carry a weight so long it became part of your skeleton. At the end of the second week, Ransom told her they needed to ride into Derby for supplies. All three brothers would go. Not to help carry flour and nails, Dorrit understood, but because Ransom did not want her going down the mountain without protection on every side. The town of Derby was small enough to fit inside the grief of one man with room to spare. A general store run by a woman named Fenella Scoville, a saloon, a church, a small office that served as the law, and a scattering of houses that looked like they had been dropped from the sky and forgotten. The kind of place where everybody knew everything about everyone, and silence was just gossip waiting to happen. When Dorrit walked into Fenella's store, every head in the building turned. Not because she was a stranger, though she was, but because the three Whitfield brothers stood behind her like a wall. Fenella Scoville was 45, sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued, and possessed of the particular brand of warmth that came from having survived enough winters, both literal and figurative, to know that kindness was not weakness, but strategy. She looked at Dorrit, looked at the three mountains of manhood behind her, and broke the silence with the efficiency of a woman who had no patience for awkwardness. So the Whitfield boys finally found a girl willing to climb that God-forsaken mountain. "Welcome, darling," Dorrit smiled. It was the first real smile she had produced since arriving in Montana, and it surprised her almost as much as it surprised Fenella, who returned it with a nod that said more than words could. The smile lasted exactly as long as it took to walk out the front door. A man blocked their path. He stood on the wooden sidewalk as if he owned it, which in a sense he did. He owned most things in this valley. Ogden Hatchell was 42 years old, lean as rawhide, dressed in a black vest and black hat, a gold ring on his right hand that caught the light like a small, cold eye. He was not a large man, not compared to the Whitfield brothers, but he occupied space the way certain men do with the authority of money and the confidence of someone who has never been told no by anyone who mattered. He looked at Dorrit first, then at the three brothers, then back at Dorrit, and when he smiled, it did not reach his eyes. Margaret's three nephews finally brought a girl home, he said. His voice was smooth-cultured, the voice of a man who had learned to make cruelty sound like conversation. Let us hope this one lasts longer than their mother did. The silence that followed was not an empty. It was loaded the way a gun is loaded, heavy with potential and waiting for a finger on the trigger. Bridger stepped forward. His fist was already closed, the knuckles white, the tendons in his forearms standing out like cables. But Ransom's hand came up, not grabbing, not restraining, simply raised palm, out the way a man stops a horse. Not yet. Ransom's voice came out quiet, level, and cold enough to freeze water in August. Do not speak of my mother. Hatchell laughed, a small, private sound. Margaret was my cousin. I will speak of her whenever I choose. His eyes moved to Dorrit with an expression that mixed contempt and calculation in equal measure. You should know what family you are marrying into, girl. That land up there has more secrets than you can imagine. He walked away, still smiling, flanked by two men who looked like they had been hired more for their size than their conversation. On the ride back up the mountain, Dorrit waited until the silence had settled before she spoke. What does he want? Phelan answered, his voice low. He thinks our mother stole the family fortune when she married our father. He wants it all back. The land, the honor, everything. Bridger added through a clenched jaw. And now he knows we have one more person to lose. He looked at Dorrit, not unkindly but directly. You. The question of marriage hung over the ranch like smoke from a fire no one had lit. Dorrit had come as a mail-order bride for the Whitfield family, but the law did not recognize families. The law recognized individuals. One man, one woman, one certificate. Someone had to sign. Ransom made the decision the way he made every decision alone at night, with the weight of his mother's letter pressing against his chest like a stone. I wrote the letter, he told his brothers. I will marry her. On paper. Bridger's jaw tightened. Then she is your wife. Not ours. On paper, Ransom repeated. But she is here for all three of us. She is family. Phelan said nothing during this exchange. He stood by the window looking out at the yard where Dorrit was scattering grain for the chickens, her honey blonde hair catching the last light of the afternoon, and he turned away before anyone could notice how long he had been watching. The wedding took place at the church in Darby on a Tuesday morning that smelled of frost and pine sap. Reverend Dabney Crisp performed the ceremony with the gentle efficiency of a man who had married enough couples to know that the words mattered less than what came after. The church was nearly empty. Fenella Scoville sat in the second row, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief she claimed was for a cold. Haskell Dunmore, the old neighbor, sat in the back with his hat in his hands and his war wound aching in the cold. Dorrit wore the cream-white dress, the same one she had worn when she arrived, washed clean and pressed flat with a heated iron. The lace at her collar was delicate against her skin. The cameo brooch gleamed at her throat. She looked in that small mountain church like something fragile and luminous, a candle flame in a room full of rough wood and shadow. Ransom wore the only white shirt he owned. It pulled tight across his shoulders and was half an inch too short at the wrists, and he stood at the altar the way he stood everywhere, solid as a foundation, carrying weight that no one else could see. Bridger and Phelan stood behind him, shoulder to shoulder, their faces carved from the same stone as the mountains outside. They did not smile. They did not speak. They simply stood, two pillars flanking a third, holding up whatever it was they had all agreed to build. Do you take this woman, Reverend Crisp asked, to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do, Ransom said. His voice was steady. His hands clasped at his sides were white at the knuckles. Do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do, Dorrit said. Her voice did not waver, but her eyes in the moment before she spoke moved across all three faces before her. The man she was marrying, the two men she was joining. A family she did not yet understand, built on a foundation she could not yet see. That night, Ransom carried an extra blanket to the bedroom, the room that had been his since boyhood, and laid it across the foot of the bed. Then he picked up his pillow, tucked it under his arm, and turned toward the door. Dorrit stood beside the bed, still in her wedding dress, her hands clasped at her waist. She had expected many things from this night. She had prepared herself for awkwardness, for silence, for the stumbling negotiations of two strangers learning to share a space. She had not expected this. "You sleep here," Ransom said. His back was to her. His voice was rough, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere deep and reluctant. "I will be outside." She stared at his back. The breath of it, the way it filled the doorway like a wall. "We just married," she said softly. He stopped. He did not turn around. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to hold her breath to hear it. "I married you to protect you, Miss Pembroke, not to take anything you are not ready to give." The door closed behind him, softly, gently, with a care that broke her heart more than roughness ever could. Dorrit sat on the edge of the bed alone in a room that smelled of pine wood and leather and something she could not name. Something warm, something that belonged to him and now, by the law of a piece of paper, belonged to her. She did not know if she should feel relieved or wounded. She felt both, and the two feelings sat inside her chest like twins who could not agree on anything. Outside in the stable, Ransom settled onto a pile of straw, his pillow behind his head, his eyes on the rough-hewn ceiling. The horses shifted in their stalls, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. Bridger appeared in the stable doorway. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, looking down at his brother, the way a man looks at someone who has just done something both incredibly stupid and incredibly noble. "You are the biggest fool I have ever known," Bridger said. Silence. "But you are also the most decent man I have ever known." He said nothing more. He did not need to. He turned and walked back toward the cabin, his heavy boots crunching on the frost. Ransom lay in the dark, listening to the wind move through the valley, feeling the cold settle into his bones the way it settled into the land, deep and patient and without apology. Somewhere inside the cabin, through walls of timber and 12 years of silence, a woman he had just married was lying awake in his bed, holding a book she had carried 2,000 miles, wearing a brooch that had belonged to a mother she would never see again. And somewhere below in the valley, in a house with more rooms than any one man needed, Ogden Hatchell sat at his desk, a map of Whitfield. Land spread before him, the boundaries marked in red ink, studying it the way a wolf studies a fence for weaknesses. The real war had not yet begun. 3 weeks after the wedding, the cabin was unrecognizable. Dorrit had scrubbed the floors until the wood showed its original grain, pale and golden beneath years of grime. She had sewn curtains from flour sacking, plain but clean, and hung them in every window, so the light that entered the cabin came through softened, gentled, as if even the sun understood that this place needed tenderness. The stove was never cold now. There was always coffee in the bottle, always bread on the counter, always the smell of something cooking that made the cabin feel less like a shelter and more like a place where people actually lived. She learned the rhythms of 3 men, the way a musician learns a song by listening. Ransom drank his coffee, black, no sugar, and he drank it before dawn, standing at the window watching the darkness lift from the valley like a curtain being drawn. Bridger hated onions but loved garlic, and he ate like a man who was always in a hurry to get back to work, shoveling food with a focus that bordered on aggression. Phelan ate slowly, tasting everything, and he was the only one who ever said thank you without being prompted, though he said it so quietly it was almost a whisper. But Dorrit did not stop at the kitchen. She had not come 2,000 miles to be a cook. She learned to ride. Phelan taught her patient as a man training a young horse, which was she realized exactly how he approached it. He did not grab the reins or bark commands. He stood beside Dove and spoke in a voice so low it was nearly inaudible, explaining how to shift her weight, how to hold the reins without pulling, how to let the horse feel her confidence, even when she had none. "You do not control a horse," he told her one morning, standing close enough that she could see the amber flecks in his eyes. "You earn its trust. The rest follows." She fell 3 times in the first week. Each time she got back on. Each time Phelan was there, his hand already extended before she hit the ground, catching her with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man of his size. On the 4th day, she rode Dove across the pasture at a full trot without falling, and Phelan smiled a real smile, wide and unguarded, and she saw for a moment the boy he must have been before the world had taught him to be careful with his joy. She helped Ransom count cattle in the south pasture, riding beside him through the tall grass, learning to spot the difference between a healthy calf and a sick one, between tracks that belonged to their herd and tracks that meant something had come through in the night, something with claws. She helped Bridger at the forge, pulling the bellows while he hammered horseshoes into shape the heat from the fire, turning her cheeks red and her hair damp. Her hands blistered. She did not complain. She wrapped them in cloth at night and went back the next morning. Bridger noticed. He did not say anything for 2 weeks. Then one evening, as Dorrit was setting the table for supper, she found a small knife sitting beside her plate. The handle was carved from dark wood, polished smooth, and the blade was so sharp it seemed to catch light from sources that were not there. It was not a rough tool. It was craftsmanship, the kind of thing a man makes when he is putting something of himself into the work. "I made it for you," Bridger said without looking up from his plate, "for cutting rope and peeling vegetables. Do not lose it." Dorrit picked up the knife and held it in her palm. It was warm as if it still remembered the forge. She looked at Bridger. His face was turned away, his jaw set in its usual hard line, but the tips of his ears were red. "Thank you," she said. He grunted something and left the table, and she understood that this was as close to affection as Bridger Whitfield knew how to come, and that it was in its own rough way enormous. The three threads of her life at Elk Ridge wound around each other like the braids of a rope, each one distinct, each one pulling in a different direction, each one essential to the strength of the whole. With Ransom, there was distance. He still slept in the stable. They were husband and wife on paper and strangers in practice, separated by an invisible wall that neither of them knew how to dismantle. But Dorrit began to notice things, small things, the kind of things that a man does when he is paying attention to someone but does not want to be caught doing it. Every morning before she came down to the kitchen, the stove was already lit. The best cut of meat at supper was always on her plate, though she never saw him put it there. When she rode her out to check the fence line and got turned around in the timber, he found her within 20 minutes appearing through the trees on his bay gelding with an expression of carefully controlled calm. "I was not worried," he said. "I was just checking." But his eyes, when he saw her safe and upright on Dove, said everything his mouth would not. Relief so deep it looked like pain. With Phelan there was ease. He was the simplest of the three brothers to be near the one who made space for conversation and silence in equal measure. He told her about the horses, about the way you could read a horse's mood from the angle of its ears and the tension in its neck. He told her about the constellations that appeared above the valley in winter, the ones his father had taught him to name when he was a boy, lying on a blanket in the pasture, while the cold ate through to their bones. One afternoon, while Dorrit was learning to bridle a new horse, she stumbled, and Phelan caught her arm. His hand stayed there a moment longer than necessary. Not much, a heartbeat, maybe two, but she felt it, the warmth of his fingers through her sleeve, and she felt something else too, something that rose in her chest like a held breath, unexpected and unwanted and impossible to ignore. She stepped away. He released her arm. Neither of them spoke about it. But afterward, when she was alone in her room, she pressed her hand against her chest and told her heart to be quiet, and her heart, as hearts do, refused to listen. With Bridger, there was friction, the kind that generates heat. He still criticized. He still found fault. The bread was too brown, the coffee too weak, the stew needed more salt or less water, or something he could not articulate but knew was wrong. But Dorrit had learned to read the language beneath his complaints, and the language said something entirely different from the words. When she cut her hand splitting kindling, it was Bridger who came running with a strip of clean cloth, wrapping her palm with hands that were surprisingly gentle for their size. "Careful, you fool," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word, not with anger, but with something that sounded dangerously close to fear. When she caught a chill from the mountain wind and spent a day in bed with a mild fever, it was Bridger who left a pot of hot water outside her door at midnight. She knew it was him because she heard the footsteps heavy as hammer blows, trying and failing to be quiet on the old floorboards. From that day on, he never once criticized her cooking again. The rumor arrived before the winter did. Ogden Hatchell did not come with fire. He did not come with lawyers. He did not come with anything as crude or as honest as direct force. He came with words which were cheaper than bullets, and in a small town like Darby, far more lethal. He hired a man named Walt Jennings, a drinker with a loose mouth and a looser conscience, and sent him riding through the valley with a story. The story was simple, as the best lies always are. It went like this: the girl at Elk Ridge, the one the Whitfield boys had brought up from the east. She was not what she seemed. She was not a respectable orphan. She was a runaway from a house of ill repute in St. Louis, a woman who had serviced men for money, and the three Whitfield brothers were not her protectors, but her customers, sharing her among themselves like livestock. The story moved through the valley the way poison moves through water, invisible, tasteless, and deadly. Within a week, Dorrit could feel the change. She walked into Fenella's store on a Saturday morning, and two women who had been browsing near the dry goods counter turned and walked out without looking at her. At church on Sunday, the pew in front of her remained empty, and the pew behind her too, as if she were surrounded by an invisible barrier that decent people could not cross. Children whispered behind their hands and scattered when she looked at them. Fenella told her straight, because Fenella was the kind of woman who believed that truth, even when it hurt, was better than the slow death of not knowing. "Darling," she set her hands flat on the counter, her eyes full of the complicated sympathy of someone who has seen this kind of cruelty before and knows there is no easy cure. "The whole town is talking about you, and they are not saying anything kind." Dorrit rode home. She stepped inside the cabin. She closed the door, and for the first time since she had arrived in Montana, she cried. She did not cry because she was afraid. She cried because she was wounded in the one place she had thought she was safe. She had survived the orphanage. She had survived Mrs. Hendricks and her wooden spoon. She had survived 2,000 miles alone. But she had never been attacked in her honor, in the small, fragile, desperately guarded core of who she was, the only thing she had left that no one had managed to take from her. She was still sitting at the table, her eyes red but dry, her shoulders straight, when Ransom came through the door. Haskell Dunmore had ridden over that morning with the news. The old man had heard the rumor at the feed store in Darby and had come straight to Elk Ridge, his face dark with a rage that looked older than the current offense, as if this particular type of cruelty reminded him of something he had seen before in another place, in another war. Ransom sat down across from her. He did not speak immediately. His silence had a different quality now, not the silence of distance, but the silence of a man choosing his words with extreme care, the way a man handles something that might break. "You know it is not true," he said. "I know. My brothers know. That is all that matters." Dorrit shook her head. "It is not enough, Ransom. If the whole town believes it, they will stop selling to us. They will stop lending us seed. They will not let our horses use the public water troughs. We will be cut off on this mountain with no way down." She was right, and they both knew it. A ranch in the mountains did not survive by itself. It survived by its connections to the valley below, the threads of trade and trust that tied it to the world, and Hatchell had just set a match to every one of those threads. Bridger's reaction was immediate and predictable. He grabbed his forge hammer and headed straight for the door, his boots hammering the floorboards with a violence that shook the window panes. Ransom intercepted him on the porch, stepping in front of him with his hands up. "Hitting him changes nothing," Ransom said. "It only proves to them that we are the savages they already think we are." Bridger's face was so red it looked like it might catch fire on its own. "So we stand here and let them bury her alive with their filthy mouths," Phelan, who had been leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, listening, spoke up. His voice was calm, but it carried a certainty that made both brothers turn. "We do not need to hit anyone. We need to prove them wrong. And the only person who can do that is Dorrit." They all looked at her. She looked back, and something in her face, something that had been building for 22 years, hardened into resolve. She would not hide. She would not run. She would walk into that town and stand before every person who had whispered her name, and she would make them look at her. She rode down the mountain alone. The three brothers wanted to come. She refused. "If I ride in with 3 men," she told them, "they will say I need men to protect me." "I have to go by myself," Ransom argued. It was the most words she had ever heard him speak at once, a torrent of objections that poured out of him with the desperate energy of a man who had just discovered that caring about someone meant being terrified of losing them. She listened. She waited. Then she looked him in the eye and said the truest thing she had said since arriving in Montana. "You married me because I am brave, Ransom. Let me be brave." He yielded. But the three brothers followed at a distance, spread across the ridge above the trail, watching her ride toward town like sentinels who had been posted by something larger than themselves. She arrived on market day, the busiest day in Derby. She did not go to the saloon to find Walt Jennings. She went to the church where Reverend Dabney Crisp was preparing for the Sunday service. Reverend Crisp, she said, "I would like to speak to the congregation. A few words. After that, they may judge me however they see fit." The Reverend hesitated. He was a man of genuine faith but limited courage, the kind of minister who believed in justice in the abstract but grew nervous when it walked through his door and asked to be heard. But he had married Dorrit and Ransom. He had seen her face during the ceremony, the quiet terror and the quiet strength, and he could not bring himself to turn her away. The church was full. Half the congregation had come out of curiosity. The other half had come to watch her fail. Ogden Hatchell sat in the back row, his arms folded, his expression arranged in a smile that was not a smile but a prediction. Dorrit stood at the front of the church. She was small. The pulpit was built for men, and it dwarfed her. But she did not step behind it. She stood in front of it, in the open space between the altar and the first row of pews where there was nothing to hide behind. Her hands were clasped at her waist. Her chin was raised. Her voice when she spoke was clear enough to reach the last row and the rafters above it. "My name is Dorrit Pembroke. It is Dorrit Whitfield now. I was orphaned at 16. My father died in a coal mine. My mother died of poverty. I grew up in an institution for parentless children eating thin porridge and sleeping on bare floors. No one treated me as a human being until I set foot on the land at Elk Ridge. The church was silent, not the comfortable silence of worship, but the sharp-held breath silence of a room full of people who have just been confronted with something they were not prepared for. I have heard what you say about me, that I am a fallen woman, that I am filth, that I am not worthy." Her voice trembled, but it did not break. She would not allow it to break. "I stand here before God and before every one of you to tell you this. No man has ever touched me. My husband, Ransom Whitfield, has slept in the stable every night since our wedding because he respects me enough to never ask for what I am not ready to give. That is the man you are insulting." Murmurs, shifting bodies, eyes that had been looking down began to look up. "I did not come here for pity. I came to say that I will not run. I will stay on that land and live as a woman who deserves to be there. Anyone who wants to judge me is welcome to ride up to Elk Ridge and watch me work." She stepped away from the pulpit. Silence held the room for 3 full heartbeats. Then Fenella Scoville stood in the second row, her flour-dusted apron still tied at her waist, and began to clap. Reverend Crisp nodded. A few others followed, not many, but enough. Hatchell stood and left. His footsteps were heavier going out than they had been coming in. On the ridge above the church, 3 brothers had heard everything through the open windows. Bridger swallowed hard, his jaw working, his eyes bright with something he would have denied until his last breath. Phelan sat motionless on his horse, his hands tight on the reins, and Ransom stood like a man who has just been struck by something he cannot see. His amber eyes catching the light, and for the first time in 12 years, the land beneath him did not feel like a burden. It felt like home. Hatchell did not stop. The rumor had failed, but Ogden Hatchell was not a man who accepted failure the way reasonable people do as a signal to change course. He accepted it the way a river accepts a dam, by finding another way around. His next weapon was money. The Whitfield brothers raised cattle and sold beef hides and wool to the merchants and traders who passed through the valley. It was not a large operation, but it was steady enough to keep the ranch fed and the equipment maintained and the horses shod. Hatchell used his influence, which was considerable, to shut those markets down. He visited every merchant in the valley offering lower prices, easier credit, favorable terms, anything to ensure that no one bought from the Whitfields. He did not threaten. He did not need to. Money spoke its own language, and in that language, Hatchell was fluent. Within a month, the Whitfield beef sat unsold. The hides stacked up in the barn. Ransom sold 2 of their best breeding cows to a ranch in the next valley for a fraction of their worth, because no one in Derby would buy them at any price. Dorrit found him at the kitchen table one evening counting coins. The pile was small, pathetically small, for a man who owned a ranch and worked 18 hours a day. His shoulders, usually so straight they looked like they had been built with a level, were curved forward, bent under a weight that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with mathematics. "How much?" she asked. enough to get through March. After that, he did not finish the sentence. But Hatchell had a second prong one that cut deeper than economics. The horses vanished on a night so cold that the water in the trough had frozen solid by midnight. Four of the best animals on the ranch, including two that Phelan had spent months training, simply gone from the north paddock when morning came. The snow around the fence showed tracks multiple horses coming from the east, but the trail was confused, deliberately muddled. The marks swept and scattered with pine branches, dragged behind the thieves' horses. Phelan discovered it at dawn. He stood at the empty paddock fence, his hands gripping the top rail, his breath making ghosts in the cold air, and he shook. Dorrit had never seen him shake before. Phelan, who was gentleness embodied, who spoke to horses in whispers and touched them like they were made of something precious, was vibrating with a fury so deep it seemed to come from somewhere beneath his bones. He loved those horses the way some men love their children. And someone had taken them. Dorrit went to Ransom that night with an idea. She remembered the old nurse at the orphanage, a woman named Mrs. Giltner, who had taught her to identify plants. Yarrow for fever, arnica for bruises, echinacea for the cough that swept through the dormitories every winter and took the weakest children with it. Dorrit had not thought of these skills as valuable. They were simply things she knew the way she knew how to read and how to sew and how to make a meal from almost nothing. But on this mountain where the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away, those skills had a different weight. "Give me a horse in a week," she told Ransom. "I will ride to the ranches in the far valleys, the ones Hatchell does not control. I will trade herbal remedies for provisions." Ransom refused. Riding alone in winter was dangerous. Bridger surprisingly took her side. "She is right," he said. "Sitting here waiting to starve is the real danger." He looked at Dorrit, and for the first time there was no reservation in his eyes, no skepticism, no appraisal. There was respect, simple, direct, unconditional. "I will go with her. Anyone who lays a hand on her will answer to me." Phelan added quietly, "I know the trails to the northern ranches. I will lead." Ransom looked at the three of them, his wife, his brothers, the people who depended on him and who were, in this moment, asking him to depend on them. He nodded. "Go. Be back in 5 days." They rode out at dawn, three figures on horseback, moving through a landscape of white and gray and dark green, the mountains pressing close on either side like the walls of a corridor that led somewhere none of them had been before. The first ranch was a small spread run by a family named Yardley, with a sick baby and no medicine within 100 miles. Dorrit brewed a tea of yarrow and elderflower, sat up through the night, with the child sponging its forehead, whispering the same words she had whispered to herself in the orphanage when the dark got too heavy. By morning, the fever had broken. The baby was sleeping. The mother, a woman so exhausted she looked 10 years older than she was, wept into Dorrit's shoulder and pressed 40 pounds of flour and a laying hen into her hands. The second ranch had an old man with broken ribs from a horse kick. Dorrit bound them with strips of clean cloth in a splint fashioned from straight pine branches. Her fingers sure and steady, her voice calm. The old man gripped her wrist when she was done and said with the gruff sincerity of a man who does not waste words, "You have hands that know what they are doing, girl." She received lamp oil and salt in return. The third ranch belonged to Nettie Blackwood. Nettie was 55 years old, built like a fence post, hard and weathered, and impossible to knock down. She had buried 2 husbands and a son, and she ran 200 acres of mountain ranch by herself with the help of a dog, a rifle, and a temperament that made grown men cross the street when they saw her coming. She did not need medicine. She did not need anything. But she listened to Dorrit's story, the whole of it, from Philadelphia to Elk Ridge to Hatchell's campaign of destruction, and when it was done, she looked at Dorrit with an expression that was not pity, but recognition. "You remind me of myself when I was young," she said. "Showed up here with nothing but backbone." She gave them a milk cow and a promise. "When Hatchell comes for you again, and he will, you send word. I have friends he does not want to cross." On the second night, camped in a clearing, surrounded by pines so tall they seemed to hold up the sky, Bridger and Dorrit sat by the fire while Phelan slept. The flames threw shifting shadows across Bridger's face, softening the hard edges, making him look almost young. He spoke without looking at her. His voice was rough as always, but lower than she had ever heard it, stripped down to something honest and vulnerable like metal, fresh from the forge before it has been hardened. I hate to admit it, he said, but you belong with us. Dorrit watched the fire. Why do you hate admitting it? Because if I admit it, I have to be afraid of losing you. And I have already lost enough. She placed her hand on his shoulder. Briefly, gently. He went rigid, every muscle in his body locking the way a man's body locks. When it encounters something it has forgotten how to process. Then slowly he exhaled. His shoulders dropped. The fire cracked and sent sparks spinning into the dark. They sat there until the sky began to lighten, and neither of them spoke again, because some things were said better by sitting together in silence than by any words in any language. On the third night, Phelan led Dorrit to the top of a ridge between valleys. Below them, the Bitterroot Valley spread out in every direction, blanketed in snow glowing under a moon so bright, it turned the landscape into something that belonged in a painting rather than in life. The mountains stood like sentinels along the horizon, their peaks sharp against the stars. Beautiful, Dorrit whispered. Phelan stood beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the cold air. He was looking at her, not at the valley. Yes, he said. Beautiful. She turned. Their eyes met. The distance between them was inches. She could see the amber of his irises, could feel his breath warm on her face, could hear the silence between his heartbeats. Something rose in her chest, sharp and sweet and impossible. She stepped back. Phelan, he nodded. He did not need her to finish. I know, he said, he deserves you more, and you deserve him. His voice was sad, but there was no bitterness in it, only the calm acceptance of a man who has looked at the truth and decided not to fight it. They stood on the ridge for a moment longer, two figures outlined against the moon, and then they turned and walked back to camp, and the moment closed behind them like a door that would not open again. They returned to Elk Ridge with provisions enough to last through spring. The cabin was stocked. The cellar was full. Ransom looked at the supplies, then looked at Dorrit, and something moved behind his eyes. Something that had been frozen for 12 years, shifting, cracking, beginning to thaw. You did this, he said. We did this, she corrected. All of us. 2 weeks passed. The ranch settled into a rhythm that felt for the first time sustainable. But Hatchell had been watching. He had followed the trading expedition through reports from his men. He had watched Dorrit ride from ranch to ranch, building connections, earning trust, creating a network that did not run through his territory. He understood with the cold clarity of a man who thinks of people as pieces on a board that Dorrit Pembroke Whitfield was not a dependent. She was the keystone. Remove her, and the arch collapsed. The morning was early and cold when Dorrit rode Dove down to the creek. She went alone, as she often did, in the first light, carrying laundry in a canvas sack. It was her private time, the 30 minutes each day, that belonged to no one but her, when she could listen to the water and feel the cold air on her face and remember that she was alive, and that being alive despite everything was a gift. She did not hear them until it was too late. Two men stepped from behind the tree line. They moved fast, practiced the way men move who have done ugly work before. A burlap sack went over her head. Rough hands grabbed her arms. She was lifted and thrown across the back of a horse so hard that the breath went out of her body like a door slamming shut. She did not scream. Her mouth was covered. But she kicked hard, catching the horse in the flank with the heel of her boot. The animal shrieked a high, piercing sound that cut through the morning like a blade and bolted sideways. The men cursed. They regained control. They rode. Dove riderless, her reins trailing in the dirt, turned and ran. She ran back to the only place she knew. Back to the ranch. Back to the stable where Phelan was feeding the horses. He saw her coming from 100 yards away, galloping with an empty saddle and wild eyes, and the bottom fell out of his world. He shouted, one word, a name that tore out of his throat like something being ripped from his chest by its roots. Ransom came out of the cabin at a dead run. Bridger emerged from the forge hammer still in hand. They saw the horse. They saw the empty saddle. They understood. 5 minutes, that was all it took. 5 minutes to saddle 3 horses, grab weapons, and ride down the mountain at a pace that would have killed lesser animals. Haskell Dunmore heard the hoofbeats from his cabin on the eastern slope and joined them without asking a single question. He did not need to ask. He had been a soldier. He knew the sound of men riding toward a fight. Ransom tracked the prints in the melting snow, boot marks, horse marks, drag marks where her heels had scraped the ground. He followed them the way a wolf follows blood, silent, focused with a precision that left no room for error. and no room for the fear that was eating through his ribs like acid. Bridger rode with his forge hammer across his saddle, and his jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like ropes beneath his skin. Phelan rode point, reading the tracks on the ground, the way he read the moods of horses, instinctively fluently, in a language no one had taught him. The trail led to Hatchell's land, not the main house. A disused storage barn at the far edge of the property, half a mile from the residence, tucked behind a stand of cottonwoods, where no one would think to look. Inside the barn, Dorrit was tied to a support post. The burlap sack was still over her head. Her wrists were bound with rope that bit into her skin every time she moved. She was alone with two men who smelled like whiskey and leather, and the particular sour stink of men who had agreed to do something ugly for money and were trying not to think about it too hard. She was not crying. She was counting her breaths, in, out, in, out. The way she had learned in the orphanage, in the dark closet where her aunt used to lock her when she misbehaved, counting breaths because counting was control, and control was survival, and survival was the only thing she had ever been good at. The barn door exploded inward. Bridger came through first, which surprised no one who knew him. He hit the door with his shoulder like a battering ram, and the hinges gave way with a scream of tearing metal. One of the men inside reached for a knife. Phelan was already there. He caught the man's wrist and twisted a clean, efficient motion, and then his fist connected with the man's jaw with a sound like a branch snapping. The man went down and stayed down. The second man ran. Bridger caught him in 3 strides, spun him around, locked his arm behind his back, and drove him face first into the dirt floor. Ransom did not look at either of them. He went to Dorrit. He cut the ropes with his knife, the blade moving through the rough hemp with a surgeon's precision. He pulled the sack from her head. She blinked against the light, her eyes watering, her face smudged with dust, her hair tangled, her wrists rubbed raw and red. He looked at her. His face was white, completely, utterly white, as if all the blood in his body had retreated to some deep interior place where it could be used for more important functions than maintaining appearances. His hands, those massive, scarred, unshakable hands, were trembling. "Dorrit," he said. "Just her name, nothing else." But in the way he said it, in the break in his voice, in the way his eyes moved across her face, checking, confirming, desperately cataloging every detail to make sure she was real and whole and alive, there was more emotion than most men express in a lifetime of speeches. "I told you," she said, her voice rough as gravel. "The wind has not snapped me yet." He pulled her against his chest. He held her there tight with both arms wrapped around her and his chin resting on the top of her head, and he did not let go. Not for a long time. She felt his heartbeat through his shirt, hammering like something trying to break free, and she pressed her face into the hollow of his shoulder and breathed him in pine and leather, in sweat, in fear. And she felt for the first time in her life what it meant to be held by someone who would burn down the world before they let you go. Bridger stood behind them, watching. A single expression crossed his face, something that moved through his features like a shadow passing over a field. Not jealousy, recognition. The understanding that this woman had become the center of everything, and that he was part of that center too, in his own rough, necessary way. They did not go home. They went to Hatchell. All 4 of them rode to the main house in daylight. Ransom at the front. Dorrit beside him, her wrists still bearing the red marks of rope. Bridger and Phelan flanking. Haskell Dunmore behind his hand resting on the butt of his rifle with the casual ease of a man who had used it before and was not particularly opposed to using it again. Hatchell came to the porch. He was wearing his black vest, his black hat, his gold ring. His face was arranged in an expression of polite surprise, the mask of a man who has practiced innocence so many times it fits like a second skin. Ransom did not dismount. He did not shout. He did not raise his fist. He sat on his horse and looked down at Ogden Hatchell. And when he spoke, his voice was the quietest it had ever been. "You took my wife. I have 2 men who will testify they were hired by your people. I have tracks in the snow leading to your barn. You have 2 choices. The first is that I ride to the U.S. Marshal in Helena and file a federal kidnapping charge. You will lose your ranch. You will lose your freedom. You will lose it everything. The second is that you sell this land and leave this valley and never come back." Hatchell's mask slipped. Just for a moment. Beneath it, Dorrit saw something she had seen before in the eyes of Mrs. Hendricks, in the eyes of every person who had ever wielded power over someone weaker. She saw fear, not fear of ransom, fear of consequence, fear of a world in which actions finally at long last had a price. Margaret betrayed this family, Hatchell said. His voice shook. Ransom leaned forward in his saddle. My mother chose her own life, the same way Dorrit chose hers. And you do not have the right to take that choice from any woman who has ever lived or ever will. Dorrit spoke then, her voice steady despite the rope burns on her wrists and the dust in her hair and the exhaustion that pressed against her like a physical weight. I am not afraid of you. I have been afraid of living without a home, and now I have one. Hatchell looked at them, at the four men and the one woman arrayed against him, and he saw something he had not expected. He saw people who would not move. He turned and walked inside and closed the door. 1 month later, the Hatchell Ranch was listed for sale. By spring, Ogden Hatchell had left Montana for Oregon. No one in Darby said goodbye. That night on the porch of the cabin at Elk Ridge Ransom and Dorrit sat side by side under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had shattered a mirror against the darkness. The mountains were black silhouettes against a blacker sky, and the only sound was the wind moving through the pines and the soft breathing of horses in the stable. Ransom spoke. The words came slowly pulled from somewhere deep. The way water is pulled from a well, one bucket at a time. I have kept my promise to my mother for 12 years. Keep your brothers. Keep the land. I have done that, but I have never kept anything for myself. Dorrit turned to him. The moonlight caught her eyes. What do you want, Ransom? He looked at her for a long time. She could see the struggle in his face, the war between the man who had learned to want nothing and the man who was discovering painfully that wanting was not weakness, but survival. I want you to stay, he said, not because of the paper, not because of the promise, because I do not want to live without you anymore. She felt her heart break open and mend itself in the same beat. She placed her hand over his on the armrest of the chair. Her hand was small and pale and marked with rope burns. His was enormous and dark with sun and scarred across every knuckle. She covered it completely the way a leaf covers a stone, improbable and perfect. Then do not, she said. That night, Ransom did not go to the stable. The door of the bedroom closed softly behind them, and when morning came, the light that fell through the curtains fell on two people who had finally stopped being strangers and had started with all the terror and grace that the word implied being together. The valley healed the way all wounded things heal slowly, unevenly, and with scars that would never fully disappear, but would in time become part of the landscape rather than a disfigurement of it. Hatchell's departure left a vacuum in Darby that filled itself gradually the way a pond fills after a drought, one trickle at a time. The merchants who had refused to buy Whitfield beef began appearing at the ranch gate again, their hats in their hands and their apologies wrapped in the language of commerce, which was the only language some men knew how to speak. The two ranches that had been most loyal to Hatchell quietly shifted their alliances, sending word through Haskell Dunmore that they would be interested in shared grazing rights come spring. Sheriff Orland Pruitt, who had spent the better part of a year looking the other way, while Hatchell dismantled a family, turned in his badge on a Tuesday morning and was gone from Darby by Wednesday afternoon. His replacement was a young man named Deputy James Harrow, who had served 2 years in the territorial cavalry and possessed the novel quality of believing that the law should apply equally to everyone regardless of how much land they owned. But the true changes, the ones that mattered, happened not in the town, but on the mountain. Dorrit woke on the first morning after everything had changed and lay still for a moment listening. The cabin was quiet in the way that only mountain cabins can be quiet. A silence made not of absence, but of presence. The presence of timber and stone and earth, of a fire that had burned all night and was now settling into its embers, of horses shifting in the stable and wind moving through pine boughs with the soft, continuous whisper of something ancient telling secrets to something patient. She could feel Ransom beside her, though he was not touching her. He slept on his back, one arm bent behind his head, his breathing deep and even. She did not move. She simply lay there feeling the warmth of him through the quilts, listening to his heartbeat and understanding that something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of her life. She was no longer a guest in this house. She was no longer a stranger occupying borrowed space. She was home, and home was not a place, but a person who had slept in a stable for 2 months rather than ask for something she was not ready to give, and who had, when the moment came, offered not a demand but a confession. I do not want to live without you anymore." She pressed her hand against her chest, where the words had lodged themselves like seeds in soil, and she felt them beginning to grow. When she came down to the kitchen, Bridger was already there. He sat at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, his forge-scarred hands wrapped around it, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance that only he could see. He looked up when she appeared. His gaze moved across her face, reading it the way he read everything directly without pretense, with the blunt precision of a man who had never learned the art of looking away from things that were uncomfortable. He saw the change in her. She knew he did. She could see the recognition move through his features like a ripple across still water, brief and quickly gone, but unmistakable. "He deserves it," Bridger said. His voice was rough as always, the voice of a man who processed the world through iron and fire and had little patience for anything softer. But beneath the roughness, Dorrit heard something she had not expected. Sincerity. Not the grudging, reluctant sincerity of a man conceding a point, but the clean, simple sincerity of someone stating a truth he had arrived at on his own and was at peace with. "So do you, Bridger," Dorrit said. He looked at her. For a moment, his jaw worked as if he were chewing on something he could not quite swallow. Then he snorted. "I deserve decent coffee. Go make some." But his eyes were smiling. Dorrit had never seen Bridger smile with his eyes before. His mouth remained its usual hard line, his jaw, its usual granite shelf. But his eyes, those amber eyes identical to his brother's, but worn differently, crinkled at the corners, with something warm and unguarded. It lasted only a second. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual expression of aggressive neutrality. But she had seen it, and she would remember it for the rest of her life. She made the coffee. She made it strong the way he liked it. And when she set the cup in front of him, her hand brushed his forearm a touch so brief, it might have been accidental. He did not pull away. He simply picked up the cup and drank, and the silence between them was comfortable, in a way it had never been before, the silence of two people who have finally stopped fighting the same war and realized they were on the same side all along. Phelan was harder. She found him in the stable that afternoon, grooming Dove, with long rhythmic strokes of the brush, his face half hidden behind the horse's neck. He did not look up when she entered. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him work, watching the way his hands moved over the animal's coat with a tenderness that bordered on reverence. Phelan. He did not turn. The brush continued its steady rhythm. "Stroke, stroke, stroke. You are my family," Dorrit said. "That does not change." The brush stopped. He stood very still, his forehead resting against Dove's neck, his eyes closed. The stable smelled of hay and horse and leather, and the light came through the slats and golden bars that fell across his shoulders like the rungs of a ladder leading somewhere he could not follow. "I know," he said. "I just need time." She nodded, though he could not see her. She placed her hand on his shoulder just for a moment, the lightest touch, and then she turned and left. Behind her, she heard Dove shift her weight and press her muzzle against Phelan's chest, the way horses do when they sense that someone they love is in pain. Animals always knew. They always knew. 2 weeks later, Phelan was himself again. Not exactly the same, the way a bone is not exactly the same after it has broken and healed, but functional, weight-bearing, and in some ways stronger at the broken place than it had been before. He began training horses for ranches in the neighboring valleys, riding out in the mornings and returning in the evenings with the tired, satisfied look of a man who has spent the day doing the thing he was born to do. And then Haskell Dunmore brought his niece to Sunday dinner. Her name was Trudy. She was 24 with hair the color of autumn sumac and freckles scattered across her nose like stars across a small, friendly sky. She taught school in Hamilton, 20 miles south, in a one-room building with a leaking roof and 14 students who ranged in age from 6 to 16. She was not beautiful in the way that paintings are beautiful. She was beautiful in the way that useful things are beautiful. A well-made saddle, a sharp knife, a fire on a cold night. There was warmth in her and directness and a sense of humor that emerged at unexpected moments, like a wildflower growing through a crack in a rock. Phelan barely spoke to her during dinner. He sat at the end of the table eating slowly, saying nothing, his eyes fixed on his plate with the concentrated attention of a man who was trying very hard not to look at something. But Dorrit saw. She saw the way his gaze drifted toward Trudy when he thought no one was watching, the way his hand paused with his fork halfway to his mouth when Trudy laughed, the way he sat straighter when she addressed him directly, which she did exactly once, asking him to pass the salt. After dinner, when the dishes were done and the men had gone out to check the horses, Dorrit found Phelan standing at the corral fence looking out at the mountains. "She seems kind," Dorrit said, standing beside him. Phelan was quiet for a long time. Then, without looking at her, he said, "She asked me about the horses. Not the way people usually ask, not making conversation. She wanted to know how I trained them. She listened when I answered." Dorrit smiled. "That sounds like someone worth talking to." He looked at her then, and she saw something in his face that she had not seen since the night on the ridge. That clear, honest openness, but directed now towards something new. Something that was not grief or loss, but the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of beginning again. "Maybe," he said, and that single word contained more hope than any speech. The 4 stolen horses were found on Hatchell's abandoned property after his departure, penned in a back pasture behind the barn where Dorrit had been held. Deputy Harrow brought them back to Elk Ridge himself, leading them on a rope behind his own mount. Phelan met them at the gate. He went to each horse in turn, pressing his forehead against theirs, his hands on either side of their faces, whispering their names. His eyes were wet. He did not care who saw. Spring came to the Bitterroot Valley the way it always came, not gently but dramatically, with a rush of snowmelt and a roar of creeks overflowing their banks, in a sudden violent explosion of green that transformed the brown winter landscape into something so vivid it almost hurt to look at. Dorrit planted a garden. She had never planted anything before. She had grown up on cobblestones and floorboards in places where the only things that grew were mold and despair. But Phelan showed her how to turn the soil, and Bridger built her raised beds from lumber he cut, and planed himself, and Ransom brought her seeds from town, small paper in envelopes that she held in her palm like promises. Potatoes, carrots, beans, wildflowers transplanted from the mountainside, their roots wrapped in damp cloth, their petals still trembling from the journey. She planted them all in rows, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up and her hair falling out of its pins, and she felt for the first time in her life what it meant to put something into the earth and trust it to grow. Under the cottonwood tree at the edge of the pasture where Margaret Whitfield had been buried 12 years ago, Dorrit placed a stone. It was flat and smooth, pulled from the creek bed, and she carved it herself with the knife Bridger had made for her. The letters were not perfect. They were uneven, hesitant, the work of hands more accustomed to needles than chisels. But they were legible, and they were true. Margaret Whitfield, the mother who kept the fire. We will keep the promise. Ransom stood behind her as she set the stone into the earth at the base of the tree. He did not speak. He watched her press the dirt around the edges, smoothing it with her palms, making sure it was level, making sure it was right. When she stood, she reached for his hand, and his hand was already there reaching for hers. They stood together under the tree, fingers interlocked, and the wind moved through the branches above them with a sound like breathing. Bridger came to the tree later that week alone when he thought no one was watching. He stood before the stone for a long time, his hammer hanging at his side, his head bowed. Then he knelt, placed his hand flat on the carved letters, and spoke to his mother for the first time in 12 years. Dorrit, watching from the kitchen window, turned away. Some conversations were sacred, and eavesdropping on a man talking to his dead mother was a trespass she would not commit. The following week, Bridger appeared at breakfast and placed something on the table in front of Dorrit. A set of chairs and a small table built from pine hand, carved the joints tight and the surfaces sanded smooth. They were rough the way everything Bridger made was rough, without ornamentation or pretension, but they were solid and honest and built to last. "For the porch," he said, "so you have a place to read your book." Dorrit stood. She walked around the table. She put her arms around Bridger Whitfield and hugged him. The reaction was instantaneous and extraordinary. Bridger's entire body went rigid, every muscle locking simultaneously, as if he had been turned to stone by the sheer unprecedented nature of physical affection. His arms hung at his sides like lumber. His face, what she could see of it over his shoulder, was the color of a forge at full heat. His ears, enormous and usually unnoticed, blazed like signal fires. "Enough," he said. His voice was strangled. "That is enough," she released him. He straightened his shirt, cleared his throat, and walked out of the cabin with the stiff, careful gait of a man who has just survived an earthquake and is not entirely sure the ground has stopped moving. But as he crossed the porch, she heard him mutter something under his breath, and though she could not be certain, she thought it sounded like he said, "You are welcome." The evening that changed everything did not announce itself. It came on a Tuesday in late spring when the days were long and the light lingered in the valley until nearly 9, painting the mountains gold and the sky the color of old parchment. Haskell Dunmore rode up for supper, as he did most weeks, his old cavalry horse picking its way up the trail with the patient deliberateness of an animal that had carried its rider through worse terrain than this. Haskell ate well. He always ate well at Elk Ridge because Dorrit cooked for him the way she imagined a daughter might cook for a father, with care and attention and the quiet, fierce tenderness of someone feeding a person they loved. He complimented the stew. He argued with Bridger about the proper way to shoe a horse. He asked Phelan about the new filly and listened to the answer with genuine interest. He was in every way part of this family, woven into its fabric so thoroughly that his absence would have left a hole as visible as a missing wall. After supper, the others drifted away. Bridger to the forge, where he was working on a new set of hinges. Phelan to the stable, where the filly was learning to accept a halter. It was just Haskell Ransom and Dorrit on the porch, 3 chairs facing west, the sky turning colors that did not have names. Haskell drank more whiskey than usual. Dorrit noticed because she noticed everything about the people she loved. The way their hands moved, the way their eyes shifted, the small variations in routine that signaled something beneath the surface. Haskell's hands were steady, but his eyes were somewhere else, fixed on a point in the distance that was not the mountains or the sky, but something only he could see. Something far away and long ago. "I never told you why I came to this mountain," he said. His voice was different, stripped of its usual gruff humor, its comfortable roughness. What remained was something raw, like wood with the bark peeled off, pale and exposed and vulnerable. Ransom did not speak. Dorrit poured Haskell another cup of coffee, her movements slow, deliberate, giving him space. The old man looked into the cup. The steam rose and curled around his face like a ghost trying to take shape. In '62, he began, "I joined the Union Army. Not as a fighting man. I was already 43. Too old for the line, they put me on supply wagons, driving munitions, hauling wounded boys back from the field." Boys! That is what they were, 18, 19. Some of them younger. I carried them in my wagon and they screamed or they did not scream, and sometimes the ones who did not scream were worse because the silence meant they had gone somewhere inside themselves where pain could not follow, and I knew they were not coming back. He stopped, took a breath. It was the breath of a man surfacing from deep water. I left behind my wife, Percy, and my boy, Aldous, 5 years old. I promised them I would come home. I promised on the porch of our house in Pennsylvania, holding my son in my arms, kissing my wife. I told them it would not be long. Dorrit's hand found the armrest of her chair and gripped it. 3 years. Appomattox. The war ended. I survived. Shrapnel in my leg, but I walked out. I walked home. Took me 3 weeks on foot because the trains were full of soldiers and I could not wait. I walked. Every mile I thought about Percy's face when she would see me at the door. I thought about how tall Aldous would be, how he would run to me, how I would lift him up and he would be heavier than I remembered, because boys grow fast when their fathers are not watching. His voice cracked. Not dramatically, not with it cracked the way old wood cracks a small sound that reveals the depth of what is breaking. I got home. The house was dark. The door was open. No one was inside. I went to the neighbors. They told me. Typhoid had come through the town 6 months before I arrived. Percy died first, Aldous. 2 days later, the neighbors buried them in the East Cemetery under an oak tree. They did not know my wife's favorite flower. They did not know that my son was afraid of the dark and slept with a candle on the shelf above his bed. They did not know that he called me Papa Bear because I was big and he was small, and he thought the name was the funniest thing in the world. Haskell stopped speaking. The silence on the porch was absolute. Even the wind had stopped, as if the valley itself was listening, holding its breath out of respect for a grief so old and so deep it had become geological part of the bedrock of the man who carried it. I stood at their graves for 45 minutes. Then I walked away. I walked west. I did not stop. I did not look back. I walked until I found this mountain, and I thought far enough. The pain cannot follow me here. He looked at Dorrit. His eyes were wet, but no tears fell. He had used up his tears long ago, spent them in some dark private place where no one could see, and what was left was not emptiness, but a kind of clarity. the terrible luminous clarity of a man who has lost everything and has nothing left to protect except the truth. But pain followed. It follows every night. 12 years. Dorrit placed her hand over his, gently, the way you touch something ancient and fragile with reverence, and with the understanding that some things cannot be fixed, only accompanied. You stayed because you still love them, she said. Haskell nodded, slowly. The motion of his head was heavy, as if the weight of every year since 65 was pressing down on his neck. I stayed because I did not know how to live anywhere else. But when you came, he looked around the porch at the warm light spilling from the cabin windows, at the sound of Bridger's hammer, ringing faintly from the forge, at the murmur of Phelan's voice in the stable talking to the horses. When you came here, I thought Percy would be glad, because this land finally has the sound of a woman laughing in it again. Ransom reached over and placed his hand on Haskell's shoulder. The weight of it was solid, steady, the weight of a son's hand on a father's shoulder, though neither of them had ever used those words. You are family, Haskell. You have been for a long time. The old man stood. He picked up his hat from the railing and held it in both hands, turning it slowly, looking at it as if it contained something important, some small truth he needed to verify before he could leave. Well, that is enough talking for one lifetime, he said. He walked to the edge of the porch, then stopped without turning around. Mrs. Whitfield, yes, you keep these boys decent. They need you. I will, Mr. Dunmore. He nodded once, put on his hat, and walked to his horse with the careful, measured steps of a man who has just set down something very heavy and is learning slowly to walk without the weight. Dorrit watched him ride down the trail until he disappeared into the trees. Her face was wet. The tears were not for sadness. They were for something larger than sadness. The kind of tears that come when you stand in the presence of a man who has carried his wounds in silence for so long that the silence itself has become a wound, and you realize that the only thing you can do is let him know he is not carrying it alone. Ransom sat beside her, saying nothing. He did not need to. His hand found hers in the dark, and they sat together on the porch while the stars came out one by one, filling the sky like lanterns, lit by someone who wanted to make sure the world could still find its way home. The weeks that followed moved with the unhurried rhythm of a river that has found its course and no longer needs to rush. Each day brought small changes, the kind that are invisible in the moment, but taken together amount to a transformation so complete that looking back becomes an act of astonishment. Fenella Scoville became Dorrit's closest friend. Every other week when Dorrit rode into Derby for supplies, she stopped at the general store, and the two women drank tea in the back room, surrounded by barrels of flour and bolts of cloth, talking about books and recipes and the particular brand of patience required to love difficult men. Fenella had been married to one for 18 years before he died of pneumonia, and she spoke of him with a mixture of exasperation and tenderness that made Dorrit laugh, and laughter in that small back room felt like medicine. Reverend Dabney Crisp asked Dorrit to read to the children at the church on Sunday afternoons. She brought her copy of Jane Eyre, the one she had carried from Philadelphia, its spine held together now with glue and willpower, and she sat in the front pew with 7 children arranged around her like birds on a branch, and read aloud in a voice that carried to the rafters. The children did not understand all of the words. They did not need to. They understood the voice, the warmth in it, the way it made the story feel like something that was happening not in a book but in the room right there, right now, to people who were real. Nettie Blackwood sent 2 more cows and a note written in a hand as blunt as her personality. Consider this an investment in the future of the valley. Nettie Blackwood does not invest in things she does not believe in. Dorrit expanded her practice. She rode Dove to ranches throughout the valley, her saddlebags filled with dried herbs and tinctures, and the steady, unshakable calm of a woman who had discovered her purpose. She treated fevers and burns and broken bones and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from living in a place where the nearest help was always too far away. People began to call her Mrs. Whitfield on the mountain, and when they said her name, they did not whisper. They said it clearly, directly, the way you say the name of someone you trust. The ranch prospered. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, the way a well-tended garden prospers one row at a time. The cattle grew fat on spring grass. Phelan's horse training business brought in steady income. Bridger took on forage work for neighboring ranches. And Dorrit's herbal practice, which had begun as a desperate measure to survive Hatchell's economic siege, became a genuine service, something the valley relied on. the way it relied on clean water and good weather and the turning of the seasons. Phelan brought Trudy to supper at Elk Ridge every other Sunday. The table, which had once held 3 silent men eating dried meat in the dark, now seated 6, sometimes 7, when Haskell came, and the noise of it, the clatter of dishes and the overlapping voices, and the occasional burst of laughter filled the cabin, the way sunlight fills a room, reaching into corners that had been dark for years. Dorrit watched Phelan with Trudy. She watched the way he pulled out her chair, the way he listened when she talked about her students, the way his eyes followed her when she moved across the room. He did not look at Trudy the way he had looked at Dorrit on the ridge that night, with that sharp, bittersweet intensity. He looked at her differently, with something quieter and more patient, the way a man looks at a horizon he plans to walk toward rather than a star he knows he cannot reach. Trudy was good for him. She did not need him to be perfect. She did not need him to be anything other than what he was, a gentle man with strong hands and a gift for listening, who spoke to horses in whispers and blushed when someone paid him a compliment. She needed exactly that, and he needed someone who needed exactly that. And the symmetry of it was so simple and so right that it made Dorrit's chest ache with a gladness she could not explain. One afternoon in late spring, a boy rode up to Elk Ridge on a donkey. He was perhaps 10 years old, sunburned and barefoot, with the serious expression of a child who has been trusted with an important task. He handed Dorrit an envelope, touched his cap, turned the donkey around, and rode back down the trail without saying a word. Dorrit stood on the porch and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, line torn carefully from a composition book. The writing was in pencil, the letters crooked and slanting to the right, the handwriting of a child who was still learning the architecture of words. Dear Mrs. Whitfield, I heard my mama tell about you at the church. I want to grow up brave like you. Can you teach me to read books? Your friend Opaline Harper. Age 9. Dorrit read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and slid it into her copy of Jane Eyre. She placed it between the pages where Jane speaks the words that Dorrit had carried inside her own chest for as long as she could remember, the words that had kept her upright through the orphanage and the abuse and the 2,000 miles of uncertainty and the silence of a man who had been too afraid to love her and the cruelty of a town that had tried to destroy her. I am no bird and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will. She sat in the chair that Bridger had built for her on the porch that faced the valley, and she looked out at the world that had become hers. Ransom was in the south pasture mending the fence line. She could see him from the porch, a distant figure, moving along the wire with the unhurried competence of a man who has done this work his entire life and finds something close to peace in the repetition. His hat was pushed back on his head. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows. He moved the way mountains move, slowly and without any intention of stopping. Bridger was at the forge. She could hear the ring of his hammer steady as a heartbeat, the sound carrying across the yard and up through the trees. He was making something. He was always making something. That was how Bridger loved, not with words which he mistrusted, but with objects, with things he could shape and heat and hammer into existence, things that would outlast him, things that would be useful long after he was gone. Phelan was in the pasture with a new horse, a wild-caught Mustang that no one else would touch. She could see him circling the animal, his movements slow, his voice inaudible from this distance, but his posture speaking a language the horse understood, the language of patience and respect, and the willingness to wait as long as it took. The Mustang watched him. Its ears were forward. It was listening. Haskell Dunmore appeared on the eastern trail riding his old horse. At the same unhurried pace he always rode, the pace of a man who had learned that there was no point in rushing because the things worth arriving at would still be there when he got there. He came every week. He would always come. He was family bound not by blood, but by something stronger, by the shared understanding that some wounds never heal, but that carrying them together was better than carrying them alone. Dorrit held the letter against her chest. She did not need monuments. She did not need speeches or certificates or the validation of anyone who had not been there when the fire was hottest and the night was longest. She had this: a letter from a 9-year-old girl who wanted to be brave, a chair built by a man who showed love through lumber and nails, a horse that trusted her, a valley that had learned to speak her name without flinching. And somewhere below, at the edge of the pasture where the grass met the tree line, the cottonwood tree stood, the tree that Margaret Whitfield had planted. the tree that shaded her grave, the tree that had witnessed every storm that had ever blown through this valley, every fire, every flood, every act of cruelty, and every act of grace. It was in full bloom. The branches spread wide against the spring sky, heavy with leaves so green they seemed to pulse with their own light. The roots went deep, deeper than anyone could see, anchored in soil that held the bones of a woman who had loved fiercely enough to make her son promise to hold the world together, and the memory of a man who had kept that promise until a woman with a broken valise and a book of poetry, and the stubbornness of someone who had nothing left to lose, rode into his life and taught him that holding the world together was not a burden to be carried alone, but a gift to be shared. The wind moved through the branches. The leaves whispered. The mountains stood guard on every side, ancient, patient, unmoved by the small dramas of the creatures who lived in their shadow, but not indifferent to them either. Not indifferent at all. Dorrit closed her eyes. She breathed in pine and earth and wood smoke and the distant mineral smell of snow that still clung to the highest peaks. She breathed out, and in the space between those two breaths, in that small, infinite silence, she heard it. Home. Not the word. The thing itself, the actual physical, unshakable reality of belonging to a place and to the people in it, of being rooted so deeply that no wind, no fire, no cruelty, no lie could tear her loose. She had spent 22 years looking for it. She had crossed a continent to find it. And it had been here all along, waiting the way the valley waited for spring, and the mountains waited for nothing, because they had already learned the secret that Dorrit was only now beginning to understand. That home is not a place you find. It is a place you build. With calloused hands and tired bones, and a heart that refuses to stop beating no matter how many times the world tells it to be still. The cottonwood bloomed fuller that spring than it had in years, roots deep, branches wide, unshaken, unyielding. Home.